What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. This is our third video of Unit 6 Learning. And for this one, we are going to be going over operant conditioning. We've talked about classical conditioning. We extended upon that a little bit. Now we're going to get into operant. It has a lot of parts and pieces to it, so I encourage you to take it slow. Make sure you understand all the concepts. Maybe watch half the video and come back later and watch the second half, things like that, to make sure you get down all the different examples and things. There are a lot of levels to it, as we'll go over. But the basis of operant conditioning is your behavior can be manipulated through rewards and punishments, and that's shown here in this video. These pigeons were taught how to play ping pong through the use of rewards, and when they'd score on each other, one of the pigeon who scored would get a food reward, so that further reinforced the behavior and got them to continue playing ping pong against one another. So let's jump into the difference between operant and classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, we talked about how you're forming associations between stimuli, right? The neutral stimulus becomes conditioned, and the unconditioned stimulus is then associated with that conditioned stimulus. Okay, so for example, you have a sea snail being sprayed with water, splashed with water, and they pair that with a shock, right? So then eventually the sea snail came to fear the splash of water because it expected the shock. It's pairing or associating those two previously unassociated stimuli. In operant conditioning, on the other hand, forms an association between behaviors and their resulting events. Okay, so you perform a behavior and there's a consequence. It can be a reinforcement or a punishment. Okay, so for example, you have this sea lion here, plays with the ball. The consequence is he's rewarded with a piece of fish. So he does it again. He continues to do it to get that reward. Okay, so that's how behavior is manipulated through operant conditioning with rewards and punishments. And that's the key difference. You're making a choice, and you know there's going to be a reward or a punishment involved with your response. So let's talk about how this came to be. E.L. Thorndike, we'll get through a lot more psychology names in this video as well, so make sure you're taking note of these. But E.L. Thorndike came up with something called the law of effect. And he's found that responses that produce desirable results will be learned or stamped into the organism, right? That makes sense, right? We do something and we get a positive result from it. We're reinforced by it. We're going to do it again, right? That makes sense. So he put a hungry cat into this puzzle box, and he found that when he placed food or a fish on the outside, the cats worked harder to solve the puzzle box to get to the reward on the outside. And gradually, on succeeding trials, erroneous or wrong responses were eliminated, and effective responses were stamped in or learned, right? So these cats, because there was a reward outside of their box, they got better and better and better at solving the puzzle and getting out more quickly. Okay. Here's just an example of the graph of that. So you can see over time, the cats got much better and much faster learning the procedure to get out of the box to get to their reward. Building upon Thorndike's research was a man by the name of B.F. Skinner, and he created an operant chamber using Thorndike's law of effect as a starting point. He developed the operant chamber, which can also be called the Skinner box, to study operant conditioning. So he's going to take it a step further with his Skinner box. In the Skinner box, there's a bar or a key that the animal can manipulate, usually a rat or a mouse, to obtain food or water as a reinforcer. It's connected to devices that record the animal's responses and allows the researcher to have complete control over the animal's environment. You can see that here when old school computers here that were state of the art at the time, and we look at like, what the heck is that? But the rat was awarded with food when it pressed the lever. Okay? Also, the rat was able to turn off electric shocks produced by the floor by pressing the lever. So they were increasing this rat's behavior of pressing the lever through positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, a couple terms that we're going to get to in a little bit. This just showed us more of the power of operant conditioning and rewards in behavior shaping. In terms of shaping, it's an operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior closer towards target behaviors through successive approximations. Okay, so you're teaching an organism to do something through reinforcements and slowly, step by step, getting there, kind of like climbing a ladder, getting to the point you want to get to through successive attempts. For example, you have a rat down here who was shaped to sniff mines, right? That rat didn't have that natural ability. It had to be reinforced. The better that it got at finding and identifying mines, the more reinforcement it got, and it continued to work and practice at that. This manatee was shaped to discriminate objects with different shapes, colors, and sizes. Every time he was able to discriminate those objects, got a reinforcement. It encouraged them to get better and better at it. So shaping is that idea of kind of building the response you want to see to get to the end point. So let's talk some reinforcers and reinforcement. A reinforcer is any event that strengthens the behavior that it follows. So reinforcers strengthen behavior. Okay. For example, down here, a heat lamp positively reinforced a meerkat's behavior in the cold. They could get this meerkat to perform behaviors they wanted to by allowing it to have access to the heat lamp when it performed those behaviors. So there's some ways to increase behavior. You have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. I'm going to pause right here and differentiate a little bit. I want you to not think of positive and negative as good and bad. Get that out of your mind. In operant conditioning, positive and negative means addition. You're adding something in a positive situation, and subtraction. You're taking something away in a negative situation. Okay, we're going to talk about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. They do not mean good and bad. They mean addition for positive and subtraction for negative. Don't confuse that. That's a big piece. Okay. So in a positive reinforcement situation, you add a desirable stimulus. For example, you get a hug from your parents when you do something nice, right? Or you go to work, you receive a paycheck. You're getting something that's going to increase that behavior of going to work or doing your chores or doing something your parents asked you to do, right? Negative reinforcement removes an aversive stimulus or something you don't like. So biggest example of this, when you get in your car, you don't put your seatbelt on, there's that beeping noise that just continues and gets faster, and sometimes it gets louder. Well, they're using negative reinforcement to encourage you to put on your seatbelt. So they're taking away that dinging noise to increase the behavior of wearing your seatbelt. Okay, so reinforcement always increases behavior, positive or negative. The goal is to increase behavior. So let's talk some primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcer innately reinforces stimuli that usually satisfy some biological need, like food or drink or safety or shelter. Okay? A conditioned or secondary reinforcer is a learned reinforcer. It gets its power through its association with a primary reinforcer. Your grades, praise, smiles of approval and applause. But your biggest example of a secondary reinforcer is money, right? Money allows us to access food, drink, safety, shelter, right? So that's an example of a reinforcer that has come to reinforce our behavior because it is connected in some way to a primary reinforcer like these. Primary are much more powerful. We also have immediate and delayed reinforcers. So an immediate reinforcer occurs closely to a behavior in time. A rat gets food pellet for pressing the bar right away, right? Okay. A delayed reinforcer is a reinforcer that is delayed in time for a certain behavior. A paycheck that comes at the end of a week or a month, right? Like teachers might get paid at the end of the month. Your parents maybe get paid at the end of every 2 weeks. You have that delayed kind of gratification. So you can think of it in that way as well. Immediate gratification is an immediate reinforcer. Delayed is down the road. You're doing something that's going to pay off later. Okay? In today's world, humans love immediate reinforcers. We're way more inclined to engage in small, immediate things than large, delayed reinforcement, which requires consistent study, right? Or effort. We want things right away, especially in today's day and age. Immediate gratification is what people are looking for. But there's also that delayed gratification or delayed reinforcer that oftentimes requires more effort, but can be a bigger payoff. Okay, so we have positive and negative reinforcers we're going to get into a little bit more. Positive reinforcement increases a response by adding or giving a positive stimulus. Remember, I just talked about positive and negative, meaning adding and subtracting, not good or bad. Okay, so for example, You get $5 for each A on your report card. That's positive reinforcement. It's going to help you or push you to do that in the future. Giving candy for every right answer in class. If I tossed out candy bars, some people would be more likely to answer, right? Because they're getting reinforced for it. Then you have negative reinforcement. This increases a response by removing an aversive or negative stimulus. Okay? Just a reminder, reinforcement is always trying to increase a behavior. Okay? For example, a negative reinforcement, you might take aspirin to relieve a headache. Right? That negative stimulus, that headache, goes away by taking aspirin, so you will continue to take aspirin in the future. Faking an illness to avoid going to school. You say, Mom, Dad, I'm sick. They say, all right, stay home. Well, you're probably going to do that again because now you don't have to go to school. Or using an umbrella to keep from getting wet. When we get rained on, we don't like that feeling of wetness. Put up the umbrella. You're not getting wet anymore. You're going to bring that umbrella, use it again in the rain. So those are examples of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Adding a stimulus to continue behavior, encourage behavior, or removing a negative to continue to encourage a behavior. So there's something called reinforcement schedules that we also need to go over. I know there's a lot of terms here, so slow down, take note, write down these examples. They're going to help with your vocab and they're going to help with your questions when you see them. Okay, examples. As many examples as you can get is going to be beneficial. And that's why we're going to do so much example work in class to differentiate these things. So you have continuous reinforcement, reinforcing the desired response each time it occurs. This needs to be used when initial learning is taking place. When you're trying to potty train a child, right, you give them a reward every time they correctly use the toilet and not their diaper. Right? That continuous reinforcement is going to start them on the right track. Then you can move to something called partial or intermittent reinforcement. This is reinforcing a response only part of the time. Though it results in slower acquisition in the beginning. That's why we do continuous reinforcement at the beginning. But if you start with partial, it's going to result in slower acquisition, but it does show greater resistance to extinction later on. Right? That partial intermittent reinforcement. An example of that could be like gambling, which we'll get to more specifically later. But you know that reinforcement is coming at some time, so you continue the behavior waiting and hoping that reinforcement shows up. So it has much greater resistance to extinction. So here's the schedule of reinforcements. Continuous, which we just saw here, has no further breakdowns. However, partial has a couple of other offshoots known as interval and ratio. Okay, so we're going to go over each interval and ratio and talk about the fixed and variable aspects of each. I would maybe take a picture of this, write it down on your notes if you need to help you organize your thoughts here. You can pause if you need to do that. So a ratio schedule is just a number, right? A ratio is a number. Think of it that way. A fixed ratio schedule reinforces a response only after a specified number of responses. It's a fixed number, then you're going to be rewarded. Okay? Example, piecework pay, rewards cards, right? If you are a salesman, piecework pay, you maybe get paid after selling a certain number of cars, right? Or if you really love Chipotle, they have that rewards. Maybe they say you get a free burrito after you buy 5, right? You know there's going to be this reward or this reinforcement after a specific number of trials or responses. Like buy 10, get 1 free, right? That's fixed ratio, a set number, and then you get reinforced. How about variable ratio? This reinforces a response after an unpredictable number of responses. It produces more responses than any other method and is hard to extinguish because of its unpredictability. This is the hardest this is the hardest schedule to extinguish. This produces the most consistent responses, and it's going to be harder to extinguish than any other of the schedules of reinforcement. Okay, that's something to note, right? Variable ratio is the hardest to extinguish. The biggest example is gambling, right? You never know when that slot machine's going to hit, but you know after some number, who knows what, it's eventually going to pay out. So you just keep going back to it and back to it and back to it, right? That's why gambling can become so addictive, is because variable ratio schedules are the hardest to extinguish, and they keep people coming back and playing. So that wraps up the ratio. Ratio is a number, fixed number, a certain number, you get rewarded. Variable ratio, who knows how many responses you have to go through to get rewarded, but you do know it's coming at some point. Next up, you have interval schedules. Interval just means time. Ratio, number, interval, time. A fixed interval reinforces a response only after a specified time has elapsed. Okay? You're studying for a test throughout the week, or you're getting paid every 2 weeks. Okay, so think about studying for a test throughout the week. Let's say you're studying on Monday, your test is Friday, that your studying is going to be reinforced after that certain amount of time has passed. If you're working and getting paid every 2 weeks, that your work is going to be reinforced after that specific amount of time. It's a fixed interval, fixed time. Variable interval reinforces a response at unpredictable times. This produces slow, steady responding because you're going through and you're thinking, all right, when am I going to be reinforced? I don't know. I better keep working at this steady pace. An example, if you have a pop quiz, you don't know when that quiz is coming. So you're studying slowly throughout the unit, just knowing that at some point you might experience a pop quiz, right? And then you'll be reinforced for that studying. If you're fishing, you have no idea how long it's going to take you to catch a fish. But when you do, you're reinforced at that certain time period. If you go stargazing and you're looking for a shooting star, you have no idea if you're going to see one, right? But when you do, it's exciting and it's going to bring you back for that stargazing once again at that time. Okay, so that's fixed interval, fixed time versus variable interval or variable time. Here's just a graph of the schedules of reinforcement and how and the number of responses each schedule elicits in certain amounts of time. So your ratio, your numbers are going to elicit more responses in a shorter period of time, whereas your variable schedules produce, I would say, less responses. However, they're produced over a longer period of time. Okay, so just reviewing quickly, look back over these, make sure you feel good about these terms. If you don't, write them down, highlight the ones you have questions about, and bring them into class, or go back, rewatch those parts of the video. Okay, there's a lot of different parts and pieces to reinforcement and reinforcement schedules. It's big stuff, a lot of levels. Okay, so from here, we're moving forward from reinforcement, and we're going to talk about punishment. Punishment has the opposite goal of reinforcement. It's an aversive event or a negative event, or I should say a bad event, or a bad stimuli that decreases the behavior that it follows. So your goal with punishment is to stop a behavior. Your goal with reinforcement was to continue a behavior or encourage it. Punishment, you want to stop it. Okay? So positive punishment, you're adding, remember, punishment means addition, positive means addition. You're adding an aversive stimuli or a negative stimuli, something people don't like. Okay, so for example, you want to stop your child from misbehaving, so you add this punishment, you spank them. Okay, you want to stop people from parking in a spot they're not supposed to, give them a parking ticket. Right? Hopefully, those additions of punishments will end that behavior. Okay? Negative punishment, you're taking away something those people like. So remember, negative means you're taking something away. Doesn't mean bad. You're taking it away. You're withdrawing a desirable stimulus. So a kid misbehaves, time out from privileges, such as time with friends, right? Let's say you miss your curfew. Parents take away your driver's license, or they take away your keys to your car, right? They're taking away something you enjoy to stop your negative behavior. So that's positive and negative punishment. We're trying to decrease a behavior. So in a positive punishment situation, you're giving a undesirable stimuli to stop a behavior. And in negative, it's also known as omission training. I would write that down, make a note of that. You are taking something away to stop a behavior. Okay? All right, now let's talk about the actual effects and benefits of punishment. Punishment can be the quickest way to affect change in behavior. okay, which is interesting. However, there may be some negative effects. Okay, it can be justified in some situations, but oftentimes it leads to negative effects that we don't want to see. Punishment can result in unwanted fears, right? Punishing children can lead them to fear you and not understand what's happening or why. Or organisms don't understand that punishment or why it's occurring, and it can lead to fear instead of learning. It conveys no information to the organism. They don't understand what's happening, and so it's not a great way to communicate information. It justifies pain to others when they see you punishing someone or something. They think it's okay. Unwanted behaviors reappear in the absence of punishment. So even though it can change behavior quickly, it doesn't last, right? Like the way that the schedules of reinforcement last, right? It's the unwanted behaviors will come back very quickly. Aggression towards the agent or aggression is seen as okay or right. If you're doing aggressive punishments like spanking, right? People think violence is okay. And one unwanted behavior can often appear in the place of another. So when we talk about punishment, it works quickly. However, overall, in the long run, it is ineffective, as they found in the research. And so it's much better to try to reinforce the behaviors you want to see rather than punish the ones that you don't. Okay. All right. So I know when we talked about classical conditioning, we discussed the cognitive and biological impacts on it as well, and we have to do that with operant conditioning here also. So there is evidence of cognitive processes during operant learning. We know this because from an experiment where rats were placed in a maze and allowed to explore and navigate it without any obvious reward, right? So there's no reward for this behavior. They're just placed in a maze and they can explore. And this was done by Edward Tolman. And he found that rats seem to develop this cognitive map or mental representation of the layout of the maze. And he knew this because if he blocked off the normal route that the rat would take, they found an alternate path, right? And the detour would be the shortest path around the barrier, even though there was no reinforcement for that behavior. And this brain imaging that they did pointed to the hippocampus, which makes sense, the center of memory, as the structure involved in drawing this cognitive map that these rats used, even though they weren't being rewarded for it. So there must be a cognitive process here to build these cognitive maps or mental maps. And what they found as a result of this, there's something called latent learning that was occurring with these rats. So these cognitive maps, like we said, are based on latent learning, which is learning that occurs without reinforcement, but becomes apparent when an incentive is given. So he placed these rats in the maze and allowed them to wander freely. Tolman, another name to write down, by the way. And he allowed them to just navigate for several hours, walk around, check out the maze. When the rats were later offered a reinforcement, the ones who had the chance to wander around ran through the maze more quickly than those who had not been in the maze prior, right? Which that also makes sense, but this is an example of latent learning. The rats moved through very quickly because they had learned the layout of the maze. They just hadn't had any reason to show it yet or to move through as quickly as they did. And so that latent learning manifested itself and showed itself after a reward was made present. Okay? And that's that idea of latent learning. If you think about in your mind, you probably have a cognitive map of your home. If I were to blindfold you, place you in a certain place in your home, and I said, this is where you are, get yourself to the exit, you could probably do it, right? Because you've had so much experience going through your home, and you're going to do it much faster than someone else who's blindfolded and put into your home and said, okay, find your way out. They're going to struggle. You're going to crush it, right? That's latent learning, that idea of learning doesn't show up until there's an incentive to show it. Okay, and our last thing is the biological predisposition to certain behaviors. So there are biological constraints that predispose organisms to learn associations that are naturally adaptive. Okay, Breland and Breland showed this. These two researchers showed that animals drifted or had this thing called instinctual drift towards their biologically predisposed instinctive behaviors. So even when you're trying to train or operantly condition animals, there are times when they will drift back to their natural or evolutionary drives for survival. Okay? So they would train these animals kind of like circus acts on the side of the highway for people to stop and see and enjoy. And they had trained these raccoons to place money into a piggy bank to get food, right? And what they found was when they did that with one coin, it was fine. But when they gave the raccoons these 2 coins, they started just taking the coins and rubbing them together because they knew that those coins meant food. And so it kicked in this instinctual drift or this instinctual drive to clean food and rub food, which is what raccoons do. If you get 2 pieces of food, they'll take it to water and try to clean it. Well, they were cleaning these coins because they knew food was coming. So their instinct of food cleaning was getting in the way of what Breland and Breland wanted them to do. And so they took away the coins and they taught the raccoons how to play basketball instead because the ball was too big for them to clean, right? That's the idea of instinctual drift. Okay, another example might be when we're writing our FRQs and you go back to writing the way your English teachers have taught you in introductory paragraphs and conclusions and all these things that we don't need in FRQs. That's your instinctual drift, that idea that you've been taught how to write this. This is the way you write your entire life. And psychology FRQs are much different than that. So we have to break through that instinctual idea or that instinctual drift of writing for you. Okay. So that wraps up our operant conditioning notes. It was a lot. Go back, look, make sure you have examples down, take your time. Let me know if you need anything. We're going to do a lot of example work in class to go over schedules of reinforcement, positive versus negative punishment, to make sure you can differentiate them from each other and also differentiate them from classical conditioning. All right. Have a good one.